Welcome to the Who I Became podcast.
Well, welcome to another episode of the Who I Became podcast, where I interview leaders, thought leaders, and those that are very sophisticated like you, Mr. Jim Howard.
Okay, I like that. I'm sophisticated. That's a new one.
Well, and it's good because quite often I don't know the guests when I do Who I Became, but me and you are friends, so I can play around with you a little bit.
Yep.
Now, Jim, I guess, go on.
Thanks for having me. I mean, I appreciate it. I know we've been trying to do this, so I'm really excited about helping you out on this. I think it's very important to get to learn the people that you're dealing with in this type of environment.
Yeah, and Jim, and I joke around, and we've been friends for a while, but I do want to sort of share a little bit about your background and stuff that you've done, because there's a lot of things that, as I research my guests and talk to them, I find out that I don't know about them. But you were born and raised in Texas, and that you joined the Air Force at 18 years old, so you're a very, very young pup when you entered sort of a uniform life, and then at 21, you joined the Norfolk Police Department, where you served in Vice. I'm sure there's some interesting stories there. Narcotics, which for me being British that's just true American policeman. That is working in narcotics. It's they can't be called drugs, they're going to be narcotics. And then crisis negotiation as well, another interesting path that you took. And your last assignment with Norfolk Police Department was a patrol sergeant. And then we might get into this in our conversation, but in 2001, you left to conduct worldwide security and executive protection at the World Bank in D.C. But as your friend, I can say, I noticed you only stayed for a short amount of time, so we might have to talk about the transition between law enforcement and working in the corporate world. But you then spent 4 years working with a public safety software company. And then we're going to get a little bit about what you do now. And I know that your daughter heavily plays into your technical skills. So I don't know how on earth you spent 4 years at a software company, Jim, with your IT skills.
Okay.
You see how this is going to go, aren't you? So it's going
yes, I can.
Yeah. And then you moved to Florida, where you got back into policing with Bel Air Police Department. And in around 2006, that's when you had the calling to start Trinity Security Allies, where you were the executive director. And you now help churches all over the country with safety and security. And I know you still give back with your police career that you train at the local police academy. So despite all the jokes, a very strong career. And thank you for joining me today, Jim.
Well, thank you for having me, Simon. Really, thank you for having me.
Now, I know there's two significant events that happened in your life, Jim, because part of the Who I Became is to interview sort of thought leaders, to talk about successes, failures, and just those things that have shaped and made them the person that they are today. And there's really two defining moments in your life. One is when you got carjacked, and that sort of later led you on a trajectory where you later joined the police. But also when you were 16 years old, sadly, your father committed murder and killed the deacon of your church. So maybe we'll start with the killing of the deacon first, and just sort of tell us a bit about that story. Then I've got a few questions as to how that sort of shaped who you are today.
Well, yeah, and to give you the background, I was the oldest of 4 boys, and my dad was a very, in today's world, would be considered a very abusive father. Back then in the 60s and the early 70s, it was kind of natural. You would go to school and you would have a black eye, or, I remember one time I was getting ready to practice football, and my coach pointed at my legs and said, "Did you want to talk about that?" And there were some welts on my leg. And I just kind of looked at him and said, "No, I did something wrong." And I got punished by my dad. And he was just kind of like, "Oh, okay, well, if you ever want to talk about it, let me know." So, around 69, he started to take out his anger. He just was angry, and started taking out his anger against my mom. And she started talking about probably leaving. And they went to a counselor who happened to be this deacon at the church, and they separated. And so I don't think he liked the progress of what was going on. I'm not really for sure. He never really told me. But after a church service one Sunday night, he stepped out of the church and shot and killed the deacon. I think he would have shot my mom if we had not have left just a couple of minutes early. So that immediately changed our life. We went from being kind of a big duck in a small pond in Glen Rose, Texas, to moving to Pensacola, Florida, where I became, a small fish in a huge ocean. And I rebelled against God, rebelled against my mom, rebelled against just about everybody that was out there with any authority at all. I'm just thankful that I didn't get in any trouble, Kind of had a music background and was in the band and in the orchestra and in the chorus and things like that, which kept me out of trouble because you had to stay out of trouble in order to be in this. And I got to go on trips. So I made it through high school. It was just one of these things where I never expected my dad to do what he did. But as I look at it today, that was just the way it was back then, it seemed like. If it was almost like an eye for an eye. You take my wife and my sons who are going to be working the farm, and I'm going to punch you. But instead of punching me, he shot and killed him. So these are things that we don't understand. I to this day, I know it's all God's plan, but I still don't understand it. I really don't.
Yeah, and I guess so at 16 years old, Jim, when this traumatic event happens to you, I mean, you mentioned about, when your dad became abusive and you had sort of welts on your legs and, you went to school and perhaps it was the era where, people didn't ask questions. But did you know at the time that you were in an abusive household? I mean, there was obviously clearly you knew that this wasn't normal, but what could you compare your life against at that point?
Well, I mean, did I know that as an abusive household? I didn't think so, because as I said, when I would go to school, I'd have friends of mine be sitting there with a black eye, and I would go, "What happened to you?" And I mouthed off at my dad, and he hit me. So capital punishment was used a lot back in those time frames. I mean, when I look at it today, yeah, it was very abusive. I mean, when Wendy and I had our first child, I told myself I'd never spank that child. And so, but that was because of how I was raised, how abusive it was. And he hit me with a water hose one time. I mean, anything that he could get his hand on, he would hit you with it. And, I think the night that it happened, with what we do today, somebody should have been talking to him. He sat in the middle of the church all by himself. And I and my mother were on one side, and one of my brothers were with the deacon, and his son, because he had 8 kids of his own, was sitting with the deacon on the other side, and he was sitting in the middle of the church just stewing. So, if somebody stewing, if somebody would have walked up and said, "Hey, James, you want to talk about this? How are you doing?" It might have changed things, but we didn't think that way back then. We didn't think that way.
Yeah, and I know I did an interview recently with a gentleman called Lester Young, and a really sort of inspirational story and transformational story that he actually committed murder when he was 19 years old. And he said something to me which was really profound. I hadn't thought about it that way, but he said that he didn't realize at the time when he shot and killed this guy how tied he was to the victim's family for the rest of his life. And he went on to sort of tell me about how it sort of impacted not only his life, but, the victim's family, and how the two families really sort of, joined together on that day. So I guess the sort of the Deacon's family that you were sort of residing with at the time, I mean, what was that relationship like post your father taking their father away? Obviously, I know you said you moved to Florida, but was there any communication, or did you just leave in the sort of middle of the night? What did a few weeks after the murder look like?
Well, I mean, you got to take in consideration, this is way before the age of internet, email and things like that. So in order to write letters back and forth, you have to put it, in the post office and have Pony Express carry it. I mean, basically, Yeah. But the thing that I thought, and this was something that haunted me for years, it wasn't until years later, many years later, that I was able to get with one of the siblings who was 2 years older than me. And I told her, I said, I was embarrassed for my father and thought that you would hate us, because of what had happened. And she goes, it was never that way. In fact, she said, I can't tell you how many times we asked each other, I wonder what the Howard boys, because that's what we were called, the Howard boys are doing right now. I wonder how they're doing. Because I found out later that some of the sons ended up with drug addiction issues, and alcoholism and things like that. Because when you lose a father, like really, I lost a father, a mentor, a family. I mean, my whole support system, I lost everything. And I could have really easily seen myself going down a track that would have led me to something like that. But I'll keep saying this. God just said, no, I want you to stay here. And I didn't know that. I was mad at him. I didn't even want to talk to him. When people would come to me and say, God's this loving father, I would look at them and the only father I could think of was my earthly father.
Your own father.
So I didn't even want to, I was like, I can't even understand this. This is too physical to me. It's not spiritual. I couldn't get into the spiritual aspect of it. So every time I thought about it, it angered me even more. And like I said, when it wasn't just, I was 16 years old. He was about to give me a truck. And of course, the truck was going to be used like farm use, but he would let me have it so that I could do my thing, like I could go out on the weekends or I could do these certain things. But I was, like I said, a big man on campus. Everybody knew me. I had a class of 35 in my graduating class. If you could walk and chew gum at the same time, you played sports, all the sports, And so, I
guess you were raised in Texas, Jim.
Huh?
You were raised in Texas, I guess.
I was raised in Texas.
Yeah.
I played everything. And then when we moved to Pensacola, I couldn't compete because these guys that were my first year that I was there, I wasn't eligible to play, but I was eligible to practice. And these guys were, they had college aspirations and were an incredible, just the things that they did just blew my mind. And I knew that I'd have to hire a professional coach or something to get up to their level.
And just picking up something that you said earlier, it's interesting. It ties into, what that Lester Young said to me about the families become sort of intertwined post this, that, there was a lot of victims that day. And I guess there is in a murder, not just the person that was taken, which was this Deacon. These 8 children, you said, they lost their father, and that changed the trajectory of some of those boys where they got into drugs and alcoholism and some other addictions. But also, if you didn't know you're in an abusive home, your father might not have been the best father to you, but he was also a father. You and your brothers also lost a father figure as well, because part of it is the generation. You're talking about the 60s. Well, it was very common to give a child a slap in the 60s and 70s, if not a bit more. That's for, we can't judge people of yesterday on today's standards, so it is very different. So were you and your brothers then, did it change your relationship with each other when your father got sent to prison for this?
Well, being the oldest, I resented everything. I resented everything. And so I kind of was the troubled child in the family. And because of that, it caused problems with my brothers and I. We weren't as close. I knew as soon as I hit 18 years old, I was going to be out of the house. I just knew that. So I just had 2 years to go, and then I was going to be leaving. I did wait. I did wait until I graduated from high school before I moved out. I turned 18 my senior year, and I waited until then. But it was, just because I was the constant pain in my mom's side. It was a constant thorn. She was always trying to look forward. And I talk about this. She was always trying to look forward, and I was always living in the past. Woe, woe, pitiful me. And she was focused. She knew she had 4 boys to raise. She had to, work. She worked 3 jobs. I want to go back to something about my dad.
Yeah.
I want to say one thing about my dad. My dad was one of the hardest working men I've ever met in my life. We lived on a farm, and we had cattle, chicken. We had a garden, all these things like that. My dad would get up at 4:00 every morning. He would wake us up. We would go out and handle the livestock. He would go and carpool to General Dynamics in Fort Worth, which was 60 miles away. He would work 8 hours there. He would be back at 6:00, have dinner, go back out and start working in the farm, and stop at 10, go to bed and get up in the morning and do the same thing.
Do it again. Yeah.
And so to me, my dad was a hero because he worked really hard for the family. I could see it, but he wasn't there was no emotion there at all. I tell it, I don't think I ever one time heard him say he was proud of us. Can never find it. I search my mind. I think about it. I was playing Pony League baseball one year. First game of the season, he took me to it. He was in his truck. He gets out of he pulled up into the field to where the front of the truck is pointing toward the field. And I thought, oh, he's going to sit here and watch me. No, he got out of the truck, got into bed, unfolded a chair and started reading a book. Didn't even watch. I was the first batter up and got a triple. Didn't even see it, didn't know anything about the game. I got back in the truck. He didn't say anything about the game. He didn't say, how was your game or anything like that. Just drove home. But that was just the way he was. And so, like I said, hardest working man I'd ever met in my life. And I think that's where our work ethics came from. And my mom was my mom believed in the golden rule, do unto others as you do. She taught that over and over and over again. And I think that's, kind of how we were successful is because we just followed that golden rule.
Yeah, and it's interesting what you said there. And I was only smiling about your dad reading the book because it's very much like a modern day parent on a phone, isn't it? Even you're talking, this could have been in the 60s, you're talking about this, Jim, but 2020 here now, that's like when I take my young son swimming and I try not to do it myself, but you look around and every parent's on their phone and they're looking down and then the kid's up there waving and the parent's not even looking, So it's a challenge as a parent. But those things affect us, don't they? As children and as adults, we remember that stuff.
Yeah.
And so what about your relationship with your mum then? So obviously, she was in a difficult relationship. She's trying to flee the relationship. I know there's a bit more significance about actually why you'd left early that day. But what was your relationship like with your mum post your dad taking someone else's life?
I was kind of her confidant. I had at 16 years old, I was 5'11", like I am right now. I was just thin, I was a beanpole. But the Sunday that and we might have talked about it before. One Sunday, my parents got into a fight. A physical fight, and I jumped in and broke it up. And he stormed out of the house, and he came back in later and took her aside. And so she kind of looked at me and said, we're going to church, get ready. And so we got ready, went to church. On the way home, she stopped a mile away from the house and said, I'm not coming home. Go tell your dad. And of course, in my mind, I thought, I'm dying. He's going to kill me,
Yeah.
And I got home and told him, and he was kind of like, go do your chores and get ready for bed. He didn't even faze him. And it wasn't until later I found out that during that fight, when I stepped in and he came back in, he had pulled her aside and said, if he ever does that again, I'm going to kill him. And so this is where I have questions with my mom. What were you thinking? You dropped me off to go tell him that you've left. And 2 hours ago, he threatened to kill me. So, what am I doing here? So after the incident happened, our relationship was very close before. After the incident happened, because like I said, she was constantly focused on going forward, and I was constantly living in the past. I missed my friends. I missed, the incident happened September the 20th. I didn't turn 16 until October the 9th. So we were already in Florida when I turned 16. And 16th birthday is a big birthday.
The sweet 16 over here, as you have in the US.
Yeah. But she just kind of like handed me a gift, and I was upset. And she was like, why are you upset? Well, Mom, I'm turning 16. And she was like, get over it. Everybody turns 16. It's kind of like you want to have a party with all your friends. And at this time, I didn't know anybody. So,
and it sounds like perhaps, just from outside of looking in, that if you were the age you are now at the time when you had the wisdom, you might have said to your mum that, because it sounds like there's some things there to unpack, where you might have said, hey, you put me in a difficult position by sending me into the house to say, hey, Dad, we're leaving. She wasn't setting you up for success. She was setting you up for a potentially violent situation. And I fully understand why a woman would do that, because, she's live with the guy. She knows he's going to get violent, but for her son, she put you in a very difficult situation. So for Jim Howard of now might have sort of said something to his mum, but as a 16-year-old, I'm sure that must have been hard maybe that's what you've been holding on to.
Well, I'll stop you right there. Holding on to, yes, holding on to back then, yes, I probably was. There were other things that I have found out over in the last 3 years that I didn't know. I mean, newspaper articles that were found that I didn't even know existed. And it was a part of the court transcript. And when I read some of it, I probably would have lost my mind if I'd have known about it back then. I was already upset with some of the stuff that had happened. But, you know, I keep going back to this. I truly do believe that this is how God works. Not the killing of the doctor or the deacon, not that my dad went to jail, not that we went to Pensacola. These are sins of humans. You know, there's something going on there. But it's he'll take whatever happens and he'll use it to make you better. And so I'll give you a good example. You know, I know that I'll do anything for my children right now, period. I mean, when Jessica was born, that was the first time I understood unconditional love. I didn't know it before that. But when we had Jessica, our first, I would die for that child. So he was preparing me all along. And I have, you know, like I said, I'll do anything for my kid. I'm going to make sure that they know that they are in a loving family, somebody that they can come to, somebody that they can talk to, different things like that. When I see them do something, I'll pull them aside and tell them, I'm very proud of you. I'm very proud of you. I mean, when my daughter makes both of them make great grades, I'm the first guy. Let's go out and celebrate, you know, because I want them to know that we're there for them. Now, do they drive me crazy? All the time. You know, I live in the house of hormones. I mean, it's, you know, so, but I wouldn't trade it for the world.
Well, let me ask you this then, Jim, because is this something, you know, being the child of someone who's sort of taken someone else's life, do you think you ever get over it? So I guess this is sort of like going back 50 years. Is it something you ever get over? So I'll rephrase my earlier question.
It is something that is always there. Do you get over it? Yes, but it is always there. There will be times when people talk about, you know, like they smell the fresh cut grass and it reminds them of a day in time when they were kids doing stuff. There are things that will happen that will remind me, just a quick flashback of the past. And, you know, it does take you back and you can't live that way. And that was what my mom was always trying to tell me. And trust me, later on in life, I was able to tell her that, you know, if you hadn't been that way, I would have been a mess. I'd have been a mess. But she instilled in me that you can always do better. And so I give a lot to her.
Yeah, and there's an interesting piece about it. So, I mean, you had a very long and successful career in law enforcement. You know, detective, a sergeant, you know, all the different things that you've done within narcotics and stuff. But what interests me when I sort of did some research about, you know, the things that you've done and when you joined the police, and then that your dad in his sentence, because I know me and you were speaking about this before, he received a very light sentence for his crime. And I just wondered, with you going into law enforcement, did it ever sort of change your view as a young man on criminal justice at that point in time when you're perhaps sort of 17, 18 years old and your dad is sort of, the system is in his favor because it's a small town? Maybe tell the sort of the listeners a bit about your dad's trial, what he got sentenced for, and then perhaps if that changed your mind about the criminal justice system.
I really thought, I mean, and we all thought when this got started, when the trial got started, that he would get life or death. I mean, Texas was very big in the death penalty back then. And it was premeditated murder, what they had charged him with. And in actuality, when I look at the case, when I look at it as a law enforcement officer, that's exactly what it was. He had planned on doing it. And I found out recently more information that said, you're absolutely right. That's what was going on. But it was a small town, 1,540 people. The jury trial that was picked of his peers, people that knew him, and they pointed a picture. And I mean, there's other things. The doctor that the deacon, he was a doctor of the town. He was kind of an outsider. had come into town and opened up this clinic, this hospital, and he and another doctor were running it, and they were kind of outsiders. They weren't a part of, the network that was going on during that time frame. And my dad, his grandfather lived there, his brother lived there. His dad lived there. My grandfather lived there. My dad's brother lived there, my uncle. So they were well known in the town. Everybody knew them. I mean, they were well known and they were well liked. Everybody liked them. So when this happened, I was for sure he was going to get life. I mean, that's what everybody was telling us. Prosecuting attorney, we're getting life. We just know it.
Yeah.
And then the day of the trial, the day of the reading, he was found guilty by reason of insanity, which is, when you truly study what that means, he was nowhere insane at all,
Yeah.
But it's just, he had this flash of a moment that caused him to do it. And so he got 5 years. He was sentenced to 5 years. He told me later, he says, I was the model citizen when I went to jail. I did exactly what they told me to do. So in 18 months, he was out. He was out.
Yeah.
He had a job with General Dynamics. He had worked with them for years. He wasn't one of these type of people that you would look at and go, every time we let you out of jail, you go and get into more trouble. He just, I made a mistake. I mean, he never said that to me. I'm for sure there was a counselor there that he probably said it to, but he never said it to me, So,
and now, interestingly, when you joined the police, I mean, do you sort of look back and sort of smile at that and think, well, that was, that was just a sort of the system playing against the victim, or what do you reflect on that now, having a career in law enforcement?
I do feel sorry for the family. Okay. The English, his name is Robert English. I do feel sorry for that family because in actuality, I mean, he was the breadwinner of the family. He was all these. I mean, it was just one of these things that when it happened, I was angry at my dad. I was angry at my mom. I was angry at God. I wasn't angry at Dr. English, the deacon. But, I mean, did it affect my law enforcement? I learned very quickly. This is what I learned about law enforcement. In law enforcement, and listen, don't get me wrong, there were cases that I did take personal if they didn't go, had a guy put his dog on me and the judge dismissed it, said, I'd put my dog on you too. Well, it's another story for another day.
Yeah.
But I got to the point in my career that I learned that my job is to arrest. My job is also to put together the probable cause and everything necessary for the court case so an attorney can walk in and win the case and not even have to think about it. But that's the end of my job. That's all. Mine was the arrest. The trial we had Commonwealth attorneys in Virginia. That was his job. And the judge's decision on things was his job. And there were many times I got to know a lot of the judges and they would call me up to desk. Did my decision bother you? And I would kind of look at them and go, no, because I charged them. I made an arrest. Yeah. Did I want a stiffer sentence on them? Sure. Would I have liked to see a stiffer? But if you give a person probation, maybe this gives that person that second chance and they'll try to be better. And a lot of times I already knew that I was going to run into them again. They were going to be doing the same thing. So, most of them were just that way.
Well, Jim, that's interesting because it leads into my next question. But your dad kills someone. He gets the system swings in his favor. He gets 5 years. He plays the game. He's out in 18 months. Do you mind sharing a bit like what was the relationship like with your dad post his conviction and had he really changed? I mean, how did that shape you when he came out of prison?
At first, I didn't want to talk to him, and then my mom had this knack of making the wives crazy. My mom had this knack, and they would ask me about Dad, and I had this thing that I had this guilt. I had this guilt. He was my dad, And like I said, for the longest time, I admired this man. 15 years, I admired this guy. So when he finally contacted me one day, it was really it was really more arrogance than anything else. He just showed up in Norfolk one day. he was, and he ran into a police officer and he said, "My name is James Howard. I have 3 sons that are on your police department." And of course, we all look like, most of us look like Dad, and he produced identification and showed it. The officer that he talked to knew he was from Texas because he'd worked with one of my brothers, and we were all known for we were Cowboy fans in the Redskin area. It was, And so he said, "Hey, here's his telephone number." Well, he called and he got the residence of my mom, who lost her mind. And the next thing you know, we're at the hotel telling him the only place he can go is this hotel and leaving. Yeah. And so he and I sat down and started talking. And like I said, it was the guy I remembered when I was younger, but he was a lot calmer. It seemed like. But like I said, he didn't change. My last interaction with him was, he didn't change. He had an opportunity to change and raise 2 kids, and he didn't take the opportunity, and one of the kids overdosed on drugs. And I kind of blame it on him. He didn't change. He didn't change one bit. It was all about my dad. It was all about my dad. That was the thing. That was his thing. So
yeah, and it sounds like, though, you've taken so many different life lessons. There's a lot in there, but you've taken many life lessons, and I can confirm that we're friends on Facebook, and I see your feed is inundated with pictures of your daughters and stuff. And I saw one today, I think, of her first car, which is like 3 or 4 in one of those little things. You are the doting father, so it seems that a negative situation really shaped you into a very positive father, leader, mentor, and where you are today. So that's, it's really good to hear you tell that story and see about the positives that came out from that. And, as I started off by saying, there's 2 things that really sort of shaped you in that way. And then the second one was about when you were carjacked one time, and that really led you into the police. So maybe share a little bit about that story as to, how you ended up where you are today.
Yeah, I graduated from high school. I was taking the summer off. I didn't know exactly what I was going to do. I was kind of getting ready to apply at the junior college there because, like I said, I had a music background, and I played an instrument that everybody wanted. So it was kind of one of these things I felt I could get in. And I was going on a picnic one day and stopped at a convenience store, and a guy walked up and just sat in my car. And I told him to get out, and he said, "I have a gun. I'll kill you if you don't do what I tell you to do." I'd never been faced with this before. I said, "Where do you want to go?" And took him. And we drove around for an hour. At one time, I thought he was going to kill me. We went to a vacant field, and just things kept going my way. And then when I dropped him off, he told me, "If I ever see you again, I'll kill you." And 2 to 3 days later, I saw him in my neighborhood again. I made a police report. Of course, the police looked at me like this was a drug deal gone bad because I had real long hair. It's the 70s. I'm driving a white Barracuda. They're just thinking this is a drug deal gone bad. And a couple of days later, I saw this guy again. And when I did, contacted Escambia County, that's where we were. The deputy pulls up sideways into the parking lot, jumps out of his car and says, let's go. And I run over and jump in the car. We headed toward that area where he was standing. And he said, "This guy's hit us like, 6 times on robbery to individuals, and you're the only one that can identify him." We got there. It was a bus stop. He said, I said to him, I said, "This is a bus stop." He wasn't there anymore. He radios and says, "Stop all the buses." And so they call us and said, "We got a bus up here, bring him up." We went up and the deputy says, "Okay, let's go identify him." And I was like, "Can't you get everybody off the bus,
Yeah.
And let me stay in the car here, And he said, "No." He says, "I need you to identify him in the bus." And he says, "I'm going to go in front of you, and there's going to be a deputy behind you." I even made one more plea. I was like, "Don't you remember this part I told you? He said he'd kill me if he saw me again." He goes, "Don't worry about it. I got you covered."
Yeah. We just need the witness. We just need your identification.
I get on the bus and see him. He's kind of hiding. He's got his head down, pointed him out. They arrested him. He confessed. But after it was over with, I was sitting in the police car, and the adrenaline, that you feel when you're doing something like this, just was something I'd never felt before. I was so alive. And right then and there, I decided I had to do this. And that's where I went into the Air Force because I was 18 years old, told me to go into the Air Force. And when I got out, a little bit disappointed, went to Virginia where my mom had remarried, and they were up in Norfolk. My stepfather was in the Navy and been transferred up there. And so I went up there thinking I was going to go back to school. I was disappointed because the Air Force wasn't what I thought it was going to be. And one night, an Old Dominion police sergeant saw my jacket, saw that I'd been in security police, and said, "Hey, Norfolk is hiring right now." And I was unhappy with my life. That was it. That's all I needed to hear. And I went down and signed up, and my mom stopped talking to me. She was so mad at me.
Well, it's
Not that she
interesting.
hated policemen. She just was so worried about me getting hurt.
Yeah.
Being a policeman had never in my life, we talked about being an Army, or, we had the GI Joes,
Yeah.
we talked all the time about being fighter pilots, because that was kind of the age that we grew up in. But she was just shocked when I became a policeman. And then 2 years later, she kind of started talking to me again. 2 years later, my brothers joined, and it was all my fault.
Yeah. Like, you'd led everyone to the dark side.
You're the instigator here.
Well,
so she lived all the whole time that we were on the department with the scanner next to her bed and listened to calls all the time when we were working. She knew our schedule. She knew when we were out there. She
well,
was
it's
calling.
interesting.
Go ahead.
No, I was saying, it's interesting you said, I want to go back to that time when you had to get on a bus, because even you were 19 at this time, Jim, right? Or were you 18?
I was still 18. I was 18.
To get on a bus full of strangers, I'm imagining a bus that holds 60 people, you've got to get on with a cop and say, "This guy here robbed me, and he said, if I see you again, I'm going to kill you. You've got to get on." But it's interesting though, because I correlate that quite a lot to the difficult conversation you had to have with your dad when you were like 15 and a half, 16. We had to go to him and say, "Hey, Dad, Mum's not coming home. She's left you." So there's a lot of things in there that most probably gave you the strength to. No 16-year-old wants to tell their father their mum's leaving them, and no 18-year-old wants to get on a bus with a man that's just said, "I'm going to kill you if you identify me." But you did it. So it's fascinating as to maybe that was always your path that you say the Lord was leading you down.
Simon, he was. I mean, this was the path. I mean, like I said, I truly went, because after the shooting happened, I walked away from God. When I was with the Norfolk Police Department, I still was away from God. I had 3 marriages. Wendy was my 3rd wife, and I was in the midst of almost losing them, Jessica and Wendy. And I started going back to church and said, "God, I'm not. It's not working out here. I got to, help me out." And my whole life changed. And I could take it right then and there and look at every single thing that had happened to me, that he was preparing me for what I was facing. And he prepared me for the police department. Nowhere in my mind did I think about it, he prepared me to be a strong dad. He prepared me to be when I finally went back to him, he helped me become a better husband, because I was terrible. I told Wendy when I first started dating her that I was an a-hole. I told her. I said, "I'm telling you right now." And the first time she looked at me and called me an a-hole, I just looked at her and I said, I told you.
I told you so.
And she said, "Oh, I just thought you were being cute. We like bad boys, No, I wasn't a good person." Yeah. Because here was the thing. It was all about survival. Here's something that people will hear about later on. I was afraid of being abandoned. My mother had abandoned me on the side of the road. My dad abandoned me when he shot and killed the Deacon. The Deacon, who was my mentor, abandoned me. When we moved from Texas, because we didn't have the internet, things like that, all my support system abandoned me. So I went for years being afraid of being alone, that I would push people away to go find that other relationship. Because once we had a fight, in my mind, I was thinking to myself, it's over. This relationship is done. And so it wasn't until I was sitting with a counselor and was telling the story about my mom dropping me off that it hit me hard. And he goes, "What just happened there?" I said, "I don't know." And he says, "You have a fear of being alone." And about the same time, our pastor was talking about, you're never alone. God is always with you. And I could see events that had happened in my life where he was with me. Car accident. Too intoxicated, should have hit a telephone pole and tore the Corvette apart and missed it by bare inches. He's been when I was in narcotics, I was working with a bad partner, and it was getting bad and worse and everything like that. And an incident happened, and I was pulled away from that partner and put with a guy that I could trust, and the rest of my time I was in narcotics was fantastic. And it's just all these little things that when we moved to Florida, Wendy had left. She had taken Jessica. I was in D.C. when I was doing the executive protection stuff. Wendy and Jessica had left, and we had a house that we had rented. We were going to rent, and she had called them and canceled it. 2 days before we packed up and left, she called the family that owned the house and said, "Oh, we've already rented it. Sorry about that. We found this house in Trinity where a guy walked across the street. I mean, a beautiful house. 2 days we found it. A guy walks across the street and says, 'Hey, I go to a church. Would you like to go with me?'" It's all him. It's all him.
Well, and I was going to say, because one thing I want to touch on as we sort of start to wrap up is, Trinity Security Allies, you're the executive director. You started been working with churches, I think, since 2006. You got a few years on me there, Jim, which is good. And I'm really intrigued as to how the Lord led you into security ministry, because, in the last 10, 15 years, if you looked at Dr. James Densley's statistics, mass shootings are on the rise, and particularly in open door soft targets such as churches, and you've got this fantastic story that you've lived real life experience of a church shooting, so it's really powerful to see how those two worlds have now collided, and you're helping churches across the country and safety and security. So maybe tell us about Trinity Security Allies, if I can say it for you, what you're doing and how you got into security ministry.
It started when our church bought a piece of property, and they came to me because they had a building fund drive that they were trying to raise money for the building. And they came to me and said, "Would you mind watching the money go from point A to point B?" And I was searching for a place to serve. I'm not a good greeter. I don't do well in children's ministry. And so I was like, "Oh my gosh, yes, I'd love to." And I said, in 1999, I was on the police department when Columbine happened. And we studied active shooter like that, for years afterwards. And I was in D.C. 9/11. So I know about soft targets. I've got this down. And they just looked at me and said, "We want the money go from point A to point B."
Yeah, don't overcomplicate it, Jim. That was a message.
Yeah, we appreciate your expertise, but we're not interested. And so I just was like, "Okay, fine. I will, I'll be a good steward. I'll watch the money go from point A to point B." We had a guy that came in that was circumventing his supervised visitation with his kids. He would wait until his ex-wife would drop the kids off. She would go into the worship center. He would go into the children's ministry, take the kids out. When she came out to get the kids, they would say, "Charles has got them," and she would lose her mind. She told us that there was a court order saying that he could not do this. And so we said, "Okay, fine. We'll talk to him." He kind of gave us an out. We were waiting for paperwork, and he threatened his ex-in-laws. And so we told him he couldn't come back. And the very next week, the Pasco County, the sheriff's office came to us and said, "Hey, you know this guy?" And we were like, "Yeah, we know him." And he goes, "Well, he killed his landlord last week. And we're kind of wondering if, y'all might could help us out." And we were like, "Whoa, back up here. When did this happen?" And they said last weekend, the weekend that he had threatened his ex-father-in-law. So he was going there, and we just stopped him from probably doing it at the church, and he went home and took it out on his landlord. So after that, the church came to me and said, "Hey, would you mind setting up a real security team?"
Actually, what you said, Jim, maybe that's not a bad idea. Maybe we do need more than money going from A to B.
Yeah. Hey, you remember when you talked about soft targets? Let's talk about it.
Yeah.
So
you tried not to have a grin on your face during this conversation with the pastor, did you?
I was very humble.
Yeah.
But Tina Rowe, I read her stuff and your stuff. I mean, I found a whole bunch of stuff out there that I realized that I wasn't the first guy out here doing this, but I was the first guy in the area. So I was still working with the Bel Air Police Department. I was their detective. It's the little town's an hour away, so it's a 50-hour week. It's an hour there, 8 hours, hour back. So it's a 50-hour week. And that's if I didn't work overtime, because I worked a lot of overtime. And so I was called to North Carolina to do some training. And when I got back, Wendy looked at me and said, Pick one or the other. Be the top detective. You know, when you're the only detective in town, you're detective of the year, and you're the worst detective of the year. It depends on what day of the week it is, you know.
And everything in the middle.
And so she just kind of told me. She said, "Make up your mind. What do you want to do? Do you want to be a detective, or do you want to be, you know, working with churches?" And I said, if this is a choice, you know which one I'm going to take. And she said, "Go for it." And she was behind me, which was really, truly a leap of faith, because like 3 months before that, every time I spoke about it, she went into a panic mode, because we've had to trust on God. We've had to totally trust on him to make sure that all of our bills get paid, you know? And so he's been unbelievable to us. I mean, I'm not, you know, rich and, you know, living in a, you know, mansion, but I am living in a mansion. I mean, compared to, you know, what my family had and all those things like that. I'm living in a mansion compared to what I grew up in, every house that I ever was around. So I'm like I said, every month he takes care of us. So I haven't looked back.
Well, and Jim, I know, you know, we take something which is just sort of life-changing as a 16-year-old, you know, your career in law enforcement. I know there's many men's groups that you lead. There's many security ministry groups that you lead. You know, you've got Trinity Security Allies. You know, I count on you as a friend, which is why I can joke with you a little bit at the start of it, you know, but there's a lot that you do. So I'm very grateful for you sharing your story with us. So let's end with it. How can people get hold of you if they want to learn more about Trinity Security Allies and the work that you do?
TrinitySecurityAllies.com. We also have a Facebook page, Trinity Security Allies. They can get in touch with us there. My partner is my wife, you know, my beautiful wife, Wendy. She helps me with the ministry. And they can call me. The number is 727-267-0590. I throw it out there. Anybody wants to call, I'll be more than happy to.
Jim, you're lucky I don't have hundreds of thousands of followers here, because your phone might be ringing off the hook tonight. But there you go. I appreciate it. And I'll put your details in the show notes. So Jim Howard of Trinity Security Allies, thank you for joining me today on Who I Became.
Simon, thanks for having me, brother. It was a really good time.
Thank you.
God bless.
Thank you for joining us for the Who I Became podcast. If you were enjoying the discussions between Simon and his guests, make sure to subscribe, as well as share with your friends on social media. Once again, thank you for joining the Who I Became podcast.